The end of Donald Trump's presidency was marked by a mixture of fanfare, controversy, and deep division, not only within the United States, but across the geopolitical map. For many observers, the exit of Trump from the White House signaled a cooling off of global tensions, particularly with Iran, where Trump's maximum pressure campaign had pushed relations to the brink of outright war. But beneath the surface, an entirely different narrative was unfolding, one that didn't make front-page news or viral headlines but quietly festered in intelligence briefings, backdoor negotiations, and digital espionage. The so-called secret war between Trump and Khamenei didn't end when Joe Biden took office. In fact, it simply shifted shape, going underground, becoming more strategic, more personal, and perhaps even more dangerous. This conflict wasn't just about politics or nuclear programs. It was about ideology, legacy, and revenge. Trump had humiliated the Iranian regime in ways no previous U.S. president had. He authorized the killing of General Qasem Soleimani, one of Iran's most powerful military figures, sparking grief and outrage in Tehran. Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, promised revenge, not just symbolic gestures, but real, calculated consequences. While cameras turned to Biden in the post-Trump political theater, Iran intensified its efforts in cyber warfare. Disinformation, proxy influence, and quiet alliances with powers opposed to the United States. And in Trump's world, despite his departure from formal power, he maintained channels of influence through loyalists, shadow diplomacy, and networks within the global far right that allowed him to still play a part in shaping policy and perception. Intelligence communities in both countries were aware of this ongoing game. Contest of influence, retaliation, and psychological pressure that continued without public acknowledgement. The situation became more precarious as Iran's nuclear enrichment crossed critical thresholds, provoking quiet alarms in Washington, Tel Aviv, and even Riyadh. Leaks from Mossad suggested sabotage operations had been increased inside Iran, and while no official link was made to Trump, analysts whispered of his fingerprints in encouraging those plans during his final days in office and even afterward. Meanwhile, Iran-backed militias in Iraq and Syria escalated rocket attacks on U.S. bases, triggering quiet U.S. counterstrikes. But everything was calibrated, each side careful not to escalate too visibly, keeping their moves under the radar to avoid drawing global condemnation or sparking full-blown war. This strategy created a dangerous equilibrium, one built not on peace, but on fear, secrecy, and the constant threat of open conflict. What made it even more volatile was the belief within the Iranian regime that Trump would return either to power or to the political spotlight, and that his policies would once again become relevant. Khamenei, often portrayed in the West as rigid and aging, was far more calculating than many assumed. He viewed Trump not as a temporary nuisance, but as a symbol of the West's unpredictability, someone who had broken traditional diplomatic patterns and had shown that the U.S. could strike without warning or accountability. In response, Iran began investing more heavily in asymmetric capabilities, missiles, drones, and alliances with rogue actors. They even engaged in covert dialogues with elements hostile to American influence in South America and Africa, expanding their influence while drawing minimal attention. Behind all this, the narrative persisted quietly. Trump versus Khamenei was not a finished chapter. It was still being written in the shadows, and it threatened to burst into daylight when least expected. As the calendar turned and the political winds in Washington shifted from Trump to Biden, the general public assumed that a reset in U.S.-Iran relations might take place. However, the chessboard had already been set, the pieces already in motion long before the White House changed hands. Former President Donald Trump, though stripped of official power, still held immense influence, especially in foreign policy, circles that admired his confrontational approach toward Tehran. Ayatollah Khamenei, who had weathered decades of American leadership, understood that Trump was not like his predecessors. This wasn't about diplomacy, not even coercive diplomacy. Trump had rewritten the rules, and in doing so, created a geopolitical aftershock that would reverberate well beyond his term. Inside Iran, intelligence officers and cyber specialists began analyzing Trump's post-presidency moves, his speeches, his meetings, his endorsements of like-minded candidates. Every signal was scrutinized for insight into whether Trump intended to return to office or worse, whether he still maintained enough clout to orchestrate foreign policy informally through his base or media empire. Meanwhile, Khamenei approved the expansion of covert operations meant to keep American power in check, especially in regions where Iran held indirect influence. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen all became hot zones, not for declared wars, but for proxy confrontations, assassinations, sabotage, and digital disinformation campaigns. Some operations were tied back to individuals who had once been vocal supporters of Trump's foreign policy, especially those involved in the 2020 assassination of Soleimani. In the intelligence sphere, a new term was quietly adopted: legacy. Retaliation.
Yes.
This wasn't just about current policy decisions, but avenging past ones, especially those from Trump's tenure. The Iranian Quds Force allegedly began compiling dossiers on retired American generals, former intelligence chiefs, and policymakers who were closely aligned with Trump's maximum pressure campaign. The secret war had transformed from government to government, confrontation into something more dispersed: shadow agents, mercenaries, disinformation bots, and foreign influencers. Even Trump's media channels, some say, became part of the theater. Iranian digital warriors began infiltrating online spaces frequented by MAGA supporters, not to disrupt, but to understand and potentially manipulate the narratives. While Trump rallied for his political comeback, the Iranian regime monitored every word, every rally, every slogan, viewing them not as domestic noise, but as signals of future threat. And Trump, for his part, didn't stay silent. He continued to boast about the Soleimani strike, about how his administration had crushed Iran's economy and forced them into a corner. These remarks weren't forgotten. They were translated, archived, and replayed in Iranian military academies as evidence of American arrogance. For Khamenei, who saw himself as a guardian of Islamic resistance against Western imperialism, Trump's language was more than offensive, it was existentially threatening. It was a reminder that the West, when unshackled from international norms, could eliminate their leaders with drones and face no consequences. The Revolutionary Guard Corps increased its budget for ballistic missile programs despite crippling sanctions. Underground facilities expanded, some reportedly buried beneath mountains to protect against Israeli and American airstrikes. The JCPOA nuclear deal was now a corpse, and Trump's actions were considered the primary cause. Iranian hardliners used this narrative to tighten their grip on power, arguing that diplomacy had failed and that the only path forward was resistance. Meanwhile, in the West, former Trump officials joined think tanks and foreign advisory boards, some of which continued to shape Middle Eastern policy. These individuals, though outside government, were viewed by Iran as extensions of Trumpism, a movement they considered just as dangerous as official American diplomacy. Quietly, the Biden administration tried to open diplomatic backchannels, but Iran remained cold, suspicious, and reluctant. The scars of Trump's presidency ran deep. Khamenei believed that any temporary thaw in relations could be undone by Trump's return or by the ideological wave he had sparked. This belief justified their continued investments in clandestine operations, cyber warfare, and even psychological tactics, broadcasting messages into the West meant to undermine trust, fuel division, and keep America internally distracted. All the while, neither Trump nor Khamenei acknowledged the extent of their undeclared war.
Wow.
There were no announcements, no treaties broken, no bombs officially dropped. And yet, in the shadows, two aging but unyielding figures continued their duel through proxies, policy shifts, and psychological maneuvering, all while the world remained largely unaware of just how close it stood to the edge of a geopolitical abyss, while the world remained preoccupied with pandemics, economic instability, and global political theatrics. The duel between Trump and Khamenei advanced with frightening precision, masked by distractions but deadly in its design. The battlefield was no longer traditional. It had spread across continents, from the Gulf to the Mediterranean to cyberspace and even to American soil. Where Iranian influence campaigns sowed division among Trump's base, Tehran, under Khamenei's guidance, doubled down on strategic patience, an old Persian tactic that involved appearing passive while setting the pieces for a grand, punishing move. Trump, meanwhile, kept Iran at the center of his political rhetoric, invoking the Soleimani strike as a defining moment of American strength under his leadership. This wasn't just bravado, it was psychological warfare. Each mention reignited rage in Tehran and reminded Khamenei that Trump wasn't going away. Trumpism, with its aggressive foreign policy instincts, nationalist overtones, and anti-globalist stance, remained alive and potent in American politics. Within Iranian strategic circles, think tanks funded by the Revolutionary Guard began exploring how Trump's political comeback could be used to Iran's advantage. Their plan wasn't merely to oppose him, but to prepare for a two-front strategy, one that would counter Trump's aggression abroad while destabilizing his ideological movement at home. Secret Iranian documents, later leaked by intelligence intercepts, outlined scenarios in which Trump's re-election could be met with orchestrated attacks on American interests in the Middle East, followed by a wave of disinformation intended to discredit his leadership. Khamenei didn't see Trump as an individual, he saw him as a system. A disruption to the old world order and thus a unique threat that required a new kind of resistance. Inside Iraq, Iranian-backed militias continued, harassing American convoys, not enough to draw massive retaliation, but enough to bleed morale and send a message. In Yemen, support to the Houthis intensified. In Lebanon, Hezbollah refined its drone capabilities with Iranian technology. Each of these moves was logged by American defense analysts, many of whom warned that Trump's past actions had made long-term conflict with Iran inevitable. Trump, in turn, viewed any destabilization in the region as validation of his hardline stance. He used it as campaign material, boasting that such threats never surfaced during his tenure due to his unpredictability and military dominance. For Khamenei, this was maddening, a continuous provocation from a man no longer in power yet still influencing the battlefield. Trump's inner circle, including former aides and conservative media allies, echoed his sentiments and promoted narratives that vilified Iran and warned of its nuclear ambitions. This rhetoric further inflamed tensions and hardened Khamenei's resolve. Iranian operatives began targeting online American communities with bots and fake accounts, posing as Trump supporters or opponents, pushing inflammatory content to sow chaos. These psychological operations were part of a broader asymmetric strategy designed to fracture American society while shielding Iran from conventional retaliation. American cyber units responded with their own operations, including sabotage of Iranian infrastructure, interference with military communications, and even manipulation of public utilities. Each time Iran suffered a setback, suspicion fell on the remnants of Trump's security apparatus. Though no proof was offered, Iranian leadership became increasingly convinced that Trump had set into motion a post-presidency intelligence campaign informal, unregulated but highly effective. In Tehran's view, this wasn't just a fight against a country, it was a struggle against a ghost of political force that refused to die. It continued to haunt their strategies and provoke their ire. The supreme leader reportedly held multiple closed-door meetings with top military and intelligence commanders, urging them to prepare for the unexpected, a veiled reference to the unpredictability of American politics and the ever-looming return of Trump. In those meetings, plans were drawn, not just for defense, but for vengeance, for reclaiming dignity lost in 2020, and for showing the world that Iran was not a passive victim, but a master of long games and shadow wars. Iran's state-controlled media took a subtle but sharp turn in its portrayal of American politics post-2020, though Biden was the new face of the U.S., many Iranian commentators focused disproportionately on Trump, warning that his re-emergence would signal the end of diplomacy. This wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. In private circles within the Supreme National Security Council of Iran, Trump was still discussed with the urgency of an active threat, Khamenei viewed him not only as a personal antagonist, but as the embodiment of Western hypocrisy. The man who tore up the nuclear deal, enforced devastating sanctions during a pandemic, and celebrated the killing of an Iranian general, was now leading an ideological army with potential to return to power. In response, Iran intensified its clandestine network across the Middle East. Underground weapons factories sprang up in Lebanon and Syria. Missile shipments increased to Shiite militias, and intelligence gathering operations inside U.S. embassies in the region became bolder. Trump, though absent from office, had created a situation where Iran could no longer rely on predictable diplomacy. Khomeini's doctrine evolved: treat every American president as a potential Trump. This radical shift meant that the shadow war was no longer a personal vendetta, had become a permanent strategy. Iranian cyber forces began launching complex phishing campaigns targeting American defense contractors, oil executives, and political influencers. The idea was simple: gather as much information as possible, not to strike now, but to hold power over future events. The psychological toll was enormous. American agencies became increasingly paranoid, leading to internal purges, mistrust, and overreactions that further weakened their public image. Trump's continued involvement with hardline foreign policy think tanks further fanned the flames. Rumors circulated that he had private communications with foreign leaders, including those opposed to Biden's Iran policy. Though unverified, these rumors were enough to cause alarm in Tehran. They feared a future in which Trump returned more radicalized, more emboldened, and with a vendetta not just against Iran but against the globalist institutions that tried to limit his reach. Iran began floating alliances with unlikely partners, including China and Russia, leveraging shared interests in undermining American dominance. Secret military exercises took place, many with scenarios involving American carrier groups in the Gulf. For Khamenei, these were not rehearsals, they were rehearsals for vengeance. He often invoked Trump's name during internal speeches, not to mock, but to warn. "He has shown us who they are," Khamenei allegedly said in one session, according to leaked documents, "and we must show them who we have become." This was an empty rhetoric. Iranian scientists accelerated nuclear research, pushing centrifuges beyond limits once agreed upon in international deals. Underground facilities became more fortified, and rumors spread of Iran developing weapons systems not meant for defense, but for retaliation. Trump's influence was such that it reshaped Iran's military doctrine, turning it from reactive to preemptive. Khamenei no longer cared for Western approval. He saw Trump as proof that agreements meant nothing, and only strength guaranteed survival. As international watchdogs issued periodic warnings about Iran's enrichment levels, the larger story remained buried. The secret war that had been sparked by Trump's aggressive policies and continued to burn quietly under Khamenei's command. The strategic silence from both sides was deliberate. Neither Trump, through his public persona, nor Khamenei, his carefully orchestrated speeches, revealed the depth of the conflict that now defined their legacies. Instead, they engaged in a ritual dance, but privately, bound in a struggle that touched every corner of global geopolitics. Trump's growing presence on digital platforms became a focal point for Iranian analysts. His Truth Social posts, his interviews, even his rally chants were dissected in Tehran. Every time he repeated that America had been strongest under his administration, every time he invoked Soleimani's name or criticized Biden's weakness, Iran's leadership took note. They saw in Trump's rhetoric a promise that if he returned, the war would no longer be shadowed. In preparation, Iran's leadership ordered its media outlets to begin reshaping public opinion away from victimhood and toward inevitable confrontation. Documentaries were aired showcasing Iranian missile prowess. Memorials to Soleimani were expanded, and speeches from Khamenei were broadcast with English subtitles, clearly aimed at foreign consumption. Iran's proxies were instructed to hold back, to stockpile weapons, and to train for specific targets in the event of open conflict. One of the most unsettling developments was Iran's increasing interest in psychological warfare. Experts in Tehran were reportedly studying how to mirror Trump's disinformation tactics, not just in America but globally. Iranian tech teams began experimenting with AI-driven propaganda tools that could imitate Western voices, create fake political influencers, and flood social media platforms with coordinated narratives. It was a terrifying evolution of the information battlefield, and it had Trump's blueprint written all over it. Trump's former allies in the intelligence world warned of this. In off-record interviews saying that his aggressive unpredictability had forced Iran to upgrade all their unconventional warfare capabilities. Meanwhile, in America, Trump's supporters remained largely unaware of the magnitude of the Iranian response his actions had provoked. For them, Trump's Iran legacy was one of strength, dominance, and deterrence. But in Tehran, that same legacy was viewed as a declaration of permanent hostility. Every infrastructure investment, every new defense doctrine, every secret alliance Iran pursued post-2020 was linked directly to Trump's shadow. In an eerie way, Khamenei's strategic focus on Trump mirrored Trump's obsession with being seen as a wartime leader. Their psyches had become entangled, locked in a rivalry that extended beyond policy into the realm of personal vengeance. Trump had become Iran's nightmare scenario, not just as a person, but as a doctrine, one that saw diplomacy as weakness and confrontation as power.